everybody, to another episode of the Tuesday Night Grueling Truth Boxing Show, brought to you by Gridiron Mo, a new interactive football app where you get to call what you think the offense or defense should do during a live NFL game and see what all other fans across the country have also called. Remember to check out Gridiron Mo at www.gridironmo.com. As always, I'm your host for the Tuesday Night Boxing Show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I want to introduce my co-host, as always, mythical Dave Siderski. How you doing tonight, Dave?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Mike?
All right. Well, our show tonight are the 10 most exciting boxers, I guess, that we've ever seen, or in boxing history. I can tell you my criteria is I just went with guys. I don't think I've got a guy earlier than 1970 here. I know we were talking on the phone earlier that it was hard to gauge a guy, excitement level, everything, just watch him on film. I know like guys like Jack Dempsey, Henry Armstrong, Gene Fulmer, all exciting action fighters. But I tend to just kind of go with, in my lifetime, the 10 guys that when they fought, these are guys that I never missed a fight because you never knew what was going to happen. What's your criteria?
Basically the same, although I did make two exceptions on my list. But, yeah, the vast majority of my guys are modern guys from the 70s on forward. Yeah, those are the fighters that I'm most familiar with and have had the most personal experience with. So, yeah, that's easier in the end to evaluate than, in spite of the legendary stories, which are great to read, you don't have the full picture on some of these older guys. So,
all right. Will, you want to start us off with your number 10?
My number 10, and there's a bit of an irony in this one, I'm going to go with the Pac-Man, Manny Pacquiao. His most recent performance, not so much, but overall, the vast majority of his fights were very exciting. Guy had fast hands, fast feet, great footwork, explosive punching power in his prime. He had wars with the likes of Manuel Marquez, Eric Morales, Marcos Antonio Barrera, exciting victories over guys like Oscar De La Hoya, Hatton, Antonio Margarito, Shane Mosley. In the end, there weren't too many dull fights involving this guy.
Except for his last one.
Yeah, and that's why he's not higher. But I guess, we'll give him a pass on that one fight.
All right. I don't have him in my top 10. I don't remember too many really great fights, but he was very exciting, so I could see why you'd have him in the top 10. Outside of the Marquez fights, maybe the first, two Barrera fights, those were great fights, but my number 10, I'm going to go a little bit older school. I remember watching him on NBC and CBS when I was a little late 70s up through the mid-80s. Cornelius Boza Edwards. Had some legendary battles with Bazooka Limon. His Bobby Chacon fights, both of them. The second one where he lost a decision where Chacon was bleeding for about the last 7 rounds, and Freddie Pacheco's begging the doctors to stop the fight because Chacon had no chance to win. He was too far behind on points. And then it comes to the decision, and, of course, Freddie Pacheco's wrong again. He had a great fight with Alexis Arguello. Like I said, Bazooka Limon, Bobby Chacon. The list goes on and on with this guy. Rocky Lockridge, had a great fight with Rocky Lockridge. He was a fighter that was similar to guys, like a Mickey Ward and Arturo Gatti. Maybe not legendary fighters, but very good fighters that always were in entertaining fights. He fought Jose Luis Ramirez. The guy fought everybody that was anybody. So my number 10 is Cornelius Boza Edwards. What's your opinion?
Okay, I did not have him on my list, but wow, that is a blast from the past that he was.
You forgot about him, didn't you?
Didn't
you? Just admit it. Admit to all the people that are listening, the millions of people around the world, that you forgot completely about him.
He didn't enter my mind, but he was a guy that I watched with, I avidly watched in the early mid-'80s. Very fun guy to watch. Do you want me to go with my number 9?
No, because it should be my turn to start off. You don't get to go to first all the time.
Oh, okay, I got confused there for a second. Hey.
All right, my number 9 you might have forgot about since he's not an American, but he does speak American. We need to have Sarah Palin on the show sometime. My number 9 is Nigel Benn, who was in some absolute wars. I mean, Michael Watson, great fights with Watson. Iran Barkley, Robbie Sims, Doug DeWitt, Chris Eubank, multiple great fights. Almost every fight he was in was a great fight. You know, Eubank, McClellan, the McClellan fight, the KO in 10, tragically ended for McClellan in a bad way. But almost every time you watched the guy fight, it was a war. Fellaini Malinga, good fights. Stevie Collins, great fights. I mean, I think when you go down the list on him, you could pull out like 10 fights that I could sit here and watch right now and not fall asleep, and I'm getting older, so that doesn't happen too much.
We're both getting older.
Yeah, but I'm really only worried about me getting older. But all right.
Fair enough. Ben,
what's your opinion of Nigel Benn?
He did not make my list, but I can definitely see the argument for. Definitely an exciting fighter, an outstanding fighter. When the list is this short, unfortunately, you end up leaving some good guys off. And he would be one of those for me. All righty.
Well, I'll let you go next.
My number 9 is the real deal, Evander Holyfield. He was a guy that always brought it. You start with the war with Dwight Clowie, where he won the Cruiserweight title in 1986. Then you have him moving up to heavyweight. You have compelling and exciting fights with guys like Michael Dokes, Alex Stewart. Then he becomes the champion, and you have the 3 classic battles with Riddick Bowe. Then you think he's past it, but he comes back and humbles Mike Tyson twice. I'm going back in time again a little bit, but the fight he had with George Foreman in 1992, that was a pretty good one too. He didn't always pay that much attention to defense, which often made for a more compelling fight. But for a smallish heavyweight, he wasn't afraid to stand toe-to-toe and, stand his ground against much bigger men. Great heart, great resiliency, a great chin, and tremendously courageous. We'll have to give him a pass on some of his later fights, like the 2 against Lennox Lewis and, some of the later fights.
The second Lewis fight was actually a good fight, and I thought pretty close.
I would agree that it was close. Maybe not up to, typical Evander standards.
No, but it was still. It was a good, solid fight. We'll leave it at that. The first fight was crap.
Okay. Yeah. Sometimes when a guy's that exciting, sometimes you end up holding him to a higher standard.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm not being fair.
Yeah, you're probably not. Just like I wouldn't be fair thinking him and Lennox Lewis would be like Ali Frazier. So what the hell? We're all wrong sometimes.
Exactly.
All right, Evander Holyfield I disagree with because I've got him much higher. But
okay,
we'll talk about that later. My number 8 is Sugar Ray Leonard. It's an all-time great on here. If you look at his career, I know he set up Hagler, but early in his career, he was exciting. He fought good fighters. His second fight was against Willie the Bull Rodriguez, who was a solid fighter. He fights Javier Munoz in his 9th fight, good fighter. Floyd Mayweather Sr., Randy Shields was his 15th fight. Randy Shields was a really good fighter. Armando Muniz, who he stopped in 6 rounds. You look through the list here, you get Pete Ranzani and Andy Price. Andy Price was a guy who blasted out 1 round. He comes back, he beats Benitez in a fight that was almost exciting, and you're really an exciting fighter if you can make a fight with Wilfred Benitez almost exciting. His knockout against Davey Boy Green was one of the most devastating knockouts you'll ever see. Then you get the 2 fights with Duran back-to-back, where the first one he stood toe-to-toe. Everybody thought he was nuts. Dang near won the fight anyways. Comes back, moves up in weight after a title defense there and fights a very good fighter in Ayub Kalule, stops him in 9 in a really good fight. Then you get the Tommy Hearns war, which he's losing the fight. You're blowing it, kid. You're blowing it. Comes back, knocks him out in the 14th round. Then you move up, even the Kevin Howard fight. You know, you get fights with guys like Kevin Howard who knocks him down in the 4th round. He gets back up, comes back, wins the fight. Beats Hagler, of course, supposedly. I still think Hagler won. But then he goes up and challenges Donnie Lalonde, who was a very good, very underrated fighter. Lalonde's beating him, I think, on all 3 cards by a point or two when Leonard lands a big punch in the 9th round and stops him. You get the Hearns fight, which I actually think he lost. But the thing about that Hearns fight is kind of like the first one. He was behind, but he was dominating at the end. And I think if that's a 15-round fight, he knocks him out again. So my number 8 is a guy that a lot of people wouldn't think of probably, but I got Sugar Ray Leonard.
Yeah, I did not have him on my list either. I will say that Sugar Ray Leonard, growing up, was my own personal favorite fighter. I tended to gravitate more towards the guys who were pure sluggers, and Ray was kind of one of those hybrid guys that you couldn't, you can't label him as a boxer. You couldn't label him as a pure slugger either. He was kind of in between. He could do both.
Yeah, he could do whatever he had to do to win the fight.
Yeah, I can definitely see the argument for, and he was one of the guys that came to mind as I made my list today.
All right, is it my turn to start or your turn to start? I think it's my turn, isn't it? Yeah, because you're starting on even numbers, and I'll start on odd numbers, right?
I haven't done my number 8 yet, though.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Oh, all right, well, go ahead and do your number 8 then.
My number 8 is Smokin' Joe Frazier. Any guy who's involved, well, I'm gonna change what I say because I'm setting myself up here. But he was involved with 2 of the 3 most exciting fights in boxing history, in Ali Frazier 1 and Ali Frazier 3. The second fight of the trilogy was pretty good as well. It tends to be the forgotten one. His 2 losses to George Foreman, even those were exciting. Then you have a couple of good fights with a guy like Oscar Bonavena. A guy who applies relentless pressure, constantly coming forward, tremendous courage, great stamina, always came to fight. Not a one-punch knockout artist per se, but a great body puncher and a guy who would bring it for the entire 15 rounds. And I can't recall too many dull fights that he was in.
All right. I don't have him there, but I don't disagree with it. And actually, he was on my list, and he was probably around 11 or 12. And actually, I kind of put Bose Edwards in there just because I wanted to bring up Bose Edwards because I think he's a forgotten legend. And since you forgot about him, it proved me right. My number 7 is the Hawk, Aaron Pryor. And you start off with his title-winning performance against Antonio Cervantes, one of the great fighters in history, knocks him out in 4 rounds. The fight with Dwayne Johnson, I think a lot of people forget, was a big-time shootout. He even had guys like Akio Kameda who knocked him down. He had to get back up, come back and win the fight. And then you get a fight that I think ranks up there with Ali Frazier, which is Arguello Pryor 1 at the Orange Bowl. Legendary fight. He comes back at the end of the fight to pull it out. And the thing people forget is this. He was fighting Arguello, who's a seasoned veteran, and the farthest Pryor had only been to the 12th round once in his career. And he actually comes back. I think he was behind a little bit on the cards in a split decision by like a point or so, and knocks out Arguello. Devastating knockout. Comes back, knocks out Arguello again. The only problem with him is his career was a little short. His competition wasn't always the greatest. But, the guy threw as many punches you'll ever see anybody throw in a 3-minute round. He never backed down. He would get knocked down. He'd get right back up. You even look before he won the title. He beat a guy like Alfonso Peppermint Frazier, who was a really good fighter, put him out in 5. Norman Goins was a solid fighter, put him out in 9. So my number 7 is the Hawk, Aaron Pryor.
Mike, I don't disagree with a thing that you said. The only thing I disagree with is that I have the Hawk higher on my list.
Ah, good. About time you agreed with me. See, I screwed one up for you to explain, and now, after you screwed one up for me. So
that's fair enough.
All right, so where are we at? We're at your number 7, right?
Yes, we're at my number 7. My number 7 is Danny Little Red Lopez. Staple of network television in the late 70s into 1980. A tremendous puncher, even though, you look at him physically, he was tall and thin, so he certainly didn't look it. But he scored 39 knockouts and 42 victories. You have a thrilling fight with Bobby Chacon in 1974. Then you have a war with Ruben Olivares, the great Ruben Olivares, where he was down once and Olivares was down twice in the first round. I believe he went on to stop him in 2. He's the WBC featherweight champion for over 3 years. 8 title defenses. He gets off the deck numerous times to win. He was vulnerable to cuts, so none of his fights were ever dull. And then you have the classic 1979 fight with Mike Ayala, which is nip and tuck the entire way, and pretty even, I believe, going into the late rounds, and he goes on to stop Ayala in the 15th. Very good fighter. He's in the Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, he runs into, in February of 1980, a relatively unknown guy by the name of Salvador Sanchez, and the rest, as we say, is history.
And those were 2 great fights, though. He was just outgunned. I mean, he would lose every round, or dang near every round in those 2 fights, but every round was competitive. Did you bring up the fight he had with Bobby Chacon?
Yes, I did.
At the Sports Arena, Ruben Olivares, Sean O'Grady. He knocked out Sean O'Grady in 4 rounds.
Who was a pretty good fighter.
David Cote was a good fighter who he beat by decision.
Yes.
Lopez was actually my number 11. I did 4 lists at about a 5-minute time period, and the only one that he was left off of was the last one. His fight against Ayala, one of the great fights of the 70s. So, yeah, I completely agree. If I would have had 15, he would have been probably my number 11. But so you're up with your number 6.
My number 6, Ray Boom Boom Mancini. One of the most popular fighters of the early 80s. Seemingly every fight this guy was in was a war. You start with, he fights the legendary Alexis Arguello in 1981. In the end, Arguello was too much for him, stopping him in the 14th. But he gives it everything he has, and he gives Arguello a tough fight. And even though it was a loss, I think in the end that might have been his most impressive performance of his career. Then you have the title-winning fight against Arturo Frias in 1982, where he's down in the first round, and then he goes on to stop him later in the first round. Spectacular action round. Then you have the Dooku Kim fight late in 1982, which unfortunately, because of the outcome, that fight probably doesn't get the recognition it deserves because...
it was a great fight.
It really was. And
it was about the same time Arguello Pryor fought. I think it was either the same month or maybe the month. Yeah, because I think they both fought in November of 82. And
yes,
those were both legendary fights.
Yeah, and nobody knew who Dooku Kim was. The only tragedy is that the referee didn't stop it earlier. Then you have the fight with Orlando Romero, another pretty unknown guy, in I think September of 1983, somewhere around there. That was a good one too. I think he stopped him in 9. Then you have really 2 tough competitive fights with Livingstone Bramble.
Well, you skipped over Bobby Chacon, which was a 3-round war, looked like Hagler Hearns.
Yeah, that one too. And he's ahead on the cards in the first Bramble fight, but gets stopped. And the second fight was pretty close. The only problem with him was that he was one of those face-first fighters that aged pretty quickly, and by the time he was 24,
he bled easily too, which didn't help.
He did. So by the time he was 24 or so, he was basically done.
And really, I'm in the minority, but I thought he won the second Bramble fight.
He might have. He might have. I could see that argument.
I had it 143, 142, but I also load Ray Mancini, so I may not be playing fair. So
yeah,
he's
an Ohio guy.
Well, I'm from Indiana. I'm just like right across the border from Ohio, though.
Yeah.
So that was your number 6?
That was my number 6.
All right, my number 6 is the old blood and guts warrior, Arturo Gatti. Got to have him in the top 10 somewhere. You get the 3 fights with Mickey Ward. But, I mean, the fight I remember most wasn't even the Mickey Ward fight. It would be the fight with Wilson Rodriguez, where he's down early, down often, comes back to win the fight. Fought a couple really competitive fights with Tracy Harris-Patterson, Angel Manfredi, 2 great fights with Ivan Robinson. Joey Gamache knocked out quick. Oscar De La Hoya almost killed him. Then you get the 3 fights with Mickey Ward. Every fight he was in, he always gave everything he had. Great fight with Jesse James Leija. When he fought the bigger name fighters, the Oscar De La Hoyas, Floyd Mayweather, he didn't have the arsenal to fight with them. But the thing about him was, when you went to watch him fight, you saw a great fight. I mean, because the fight with Wilson, the ones that stand out to me are Wilson Rodriguez and Gabriel Ruelas, who both looked like they were about to knock him out. Then he comes out of nowhere and knocks them out. So you got Gotti higher, or is Gotti not on your list?
Gotti is your number 6 is my number 5.
Oh, we'll go ahead with it then. It'll make it an easy.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you said. Any guy who participates in 4 Ring Magazine Fights of the Year deserves to be on this list. You mentioned the fight with Rodriguez, where he overcame the knockdown in the swollen right eye to stop him in 6. The fight with Ruelas, where he was nearly stopped himself before, coming back and stopping him in the 5th. 2 great fights with Ivan Robinson and the classics with Mickey Ward. The guy won 2 championships in 2 divisions, and he had some skill to him. He wasn't just a mindless slugger. He actually had some boxing skill.
Yeah, he was a really good fighter. I mean, he just wasn't like an A-level fighter. He was probably a B or a B-plus level fighter.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would not myself have put him in the Hall of Fame. But
well, I think this, though, it's just like, putting the Rocky character, Sylvester Stallone, in the Hall of Fame. What they did for boxing and what they gave boxing was kind of bigger than what their career was.
Okay.
If you know what I'm saying. I mean, because Arturo Gatti brought, Gotti Ward to 3 fights. That brought a lot of people that maybe didn't even watch boxing, watch those guys. And I think when you get somebody like that, is what Arturo Gatti brought to boxing and the fans that he brought to boxing, is that more important than maybe would a guy that was a 3-time champion that mainstream public's never heard of?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate.
Because, if you put Ken Buchanan in the Hall of Fame, Ken Buchanan was a much technically superior fighter to him, but who had the bigger impact on boxing?
Probably Gotti.
Yeah, Buchanan maybe in Scotland, but outside of Scotland, it was Gotti. I think there's a case to be made that, Arturo Gatti has made an impact on boxing than the Klitschko brothers, and the Klitschko brothers are great fighters.
Right, but not that exciting to watch.
Yeah, so that's why I don't have a problem with a Gotti getting in. I don't have a problem with a Mancini getting in. It's like you brought up Mancini. You also got to remember he beat Jose Luis Ramirez when Ramirez was in his prime and a top-notch boxer. And if you watch that fight, Mancini actually outboxes him. Yeah,
he did, and I think he paid more attention to defense in those days.
Yeah.
Too.
And I think the Kim fight took a lot out of him. And when you get in a fight like that and you have the tragic ending like that, it's got to be hard to live with at night.
Sure. And you take all that punishment, that takes a lot out of you too.
Yeah, he didn't duck much. Real quick, we're going to take a break to pay some bills. So check out this commercial from DraftKings, and we'll be back right after this.
Your season-long fantasy football lineup is locked in and ready for action, but you don't have to wait till Week 16 to get paid. Put your fantasy skills to the test starting Sunday at DraftKings.com, America's favorite one-week fantasy football site where you could kick the season off by winning $2 million. It's the biggest fantasy football contest ever. $10 million in prizes are up for grabs, including $2 million for first place and $1 million for second. One-week fantasy means no season-long commitments. It's fantasy football on demand. Play where you want, when you want, with the players you want. Then turn your love of football into a life-changing payday. Just pick up your players, pile up the points, and pick up the cash. That's it. You've never experienced football like this. This isn't fantasy as usual. This is DraftKings. Welcome to the big time. Hurry to DraftKings.com now and use promo code SPREAKER to play for free for a shot at $2 million in the Week 1 Millionaire Maker. Enter SPREAKER for free entry now at DraftKings.com. That's DraftKings.com.
All right, we're back. This is Mike Goodpaster with Dave Siderski on the Tuesday Night Grilling Truth Boxing Show. We're going over the top 10 most exciting fighters in boxing history, and we are up to my number 5, which will be Roberto Duran. You start off with his title-winning performance against Ken Buchanan, his legendary battles with Esteban de Jesus, and then you go where he moves up to welterweight and battles Sugar Ray Leonard, beats him in one of the great fights I've ever seen the first time they fought. Carlos Palomino was a great fight, goes 10 rounds. I mean, he basically dominated the fight, but every round was competitive at least. It's just the fact that he won every round. Beat some really great fighters. Then you go later in his career, you know, he goes through the time where he loses to Kirkland Lang, loses to Benitez. He's the walkout bout after Arguello Pryor. And, I mean, he's fighting, you know, you've got Roberto Duran fighting at the Orange Bowl. After Arguello Pryor, the crowd goes from 70,000 down to 4,000 during an absolute boring fight with Jimmy Batten. Everybody thinks he's done. And then, you know, he comes back almost a year later, fights Pepino Cuevas at the Sports Arena in Los Angeles, knocks out Cuevas in 4 rounds. He gets a title shot that a lot of people don't think he deserves just off one win against Cuevas, who had been destroyed by Hearns a couple years earlier. Fights a young, talented champion in Davey Moore. Madison Square Garden, comes out, beats him. Turns that into a mega fight 5 months later against Marvin Hagler, and is actually competitive with the middleweight champion. Then he comes back, fights Tommy Hearns, and gets his head tore off. Fights a couple nondescript guys, actually loses a split decision in 12 rounds to Robbie Sims. Looks like his career is over again. He beats a bunch of nondescript guys like Jeff Lanus, Paul Thorne, Ricky Stackhouse, and if any of those guys are listening, I'm sorry I called you nondescript. Gets a title shot against a much bigger, much younger Iran Barkley, and then an epic battle, comes back, beats him in Atlantic City at the Convention Center, gets a third shot at Sugar Ray Leonard, and one of the most disappointing fights I ever saw, comes out and basically lays an egg and lets Leonard walk all over him. And then that's basically it. Other than a couple fights against Vinny Pazienza that were disputable. Hector Camacho he fought a disputable decision with. But, I mean, even like in 1997, he fought a top 10 rated middleweight, Jorge Castro, and beats him in Panama. And, you know, actually comes back and off the win over Castro gets a title shot against William Joppy in 1998. Mind you, like 27 years or 26 years after he won the title first from Buchanan. Joppy destroys him, fights 5 or 6 more times. His actual last fight was against Hector Camacho, where he lost a unanimous decision. That's in 2001, 30 years after he won the title. Ended his career at 103-16, but always an exciting fighter. I mean, he had a few lulls in his career where he was fairly boring, but when you fight 120 fights, I guess we can give you that a little bit. So you got Duran higher, or is he not on your list?
Duran is not on my list. And let me say first, it's a travesty that Camacho has victories over Roberto Duran and Sugar Ray Leonard. But that said,
I really like the Leonard one, though, because it was funny watching Leonard get knocked out in the 5th round. I didn't like him because he beat Marvin Hagler. No, he didn't, but go ahead.
I was close to putting Duran on the list, but when he was really in his prime and really good, and in that stretch where he was 71-1 or something ridiculous like that, did anybody truly, if you turn it on the TV, do you really think anybody truly has a chance to beat this guy? Probably not. And, certainly a compelling guy to watch. He fought a who's who of legends, 30-year career. You can't say enough good things about him, and certainly one of the 10 greatest pound-for-pound fighters of all time. But, if it's possible that a guy, gets left off this list because he's just not vulnerable enough, at least in his prime, that would be my reasoning.
Well, I think the main thing that made him exciting was the middle of his career, he was always vulnerable, and he would get wins like he got against Iran Barkley, then Davey Moore, and fight Marvin Hagler tough. So that's what got it for me. But we're up to your number 4.
Okay. My number 4 is Matthew Saad Muhammad. Again, a staple of network TV in the late 70s and early 80s. Held the WBC light heavyweight championship for over 2.5 years. Defended 8 times, but it seemed like no fight was ever easy for him. It seemed like every fight he'd lose the early rounds, and he was either cut or he was battered, and yet he always comes back to win. You have the 2 wars with Marvin Johnson, who was a really good light heavyweight. You have 2 great fights with Yaki Lopez, the second of which he takes an awful battering, comes back and stops him in the 14th. That fight was the Ring Magazine Fight of the Year. You have a tough fight with John Conte in 1980. The guy was a devastating puncher, possessed seemingly boundless stamina, an incredible and historic ability to absorb punishment and rally in the face of adversity and come back to win. And unfortunately, he's another one of those face fighters who aged relatively quickly because of all the ring wars that he was in. So that by the time you get to his fight with Dwight Kwawi in late 1981, I think he's only 26, maybe 27 years old, but he's basically done. And after that, you have a bunch of ill-advised fights in his comeback, and unfortunately, the sad way that his life ended. But definitely, a must-watch in the late 70s and early 80s. And one of my personal favorite fighters to watch of all time.
Well, I actually have him higher, so I'll talk about him in a little bit. My number 4 is Bobby Chacon. Bobby Chacon, you start off, his first big fight, was probably a great TKO or Chuchu Castillo. Comes back, loses another war to Ruben Olivares right after that. Comes back, the fight against Danny Little Red Lopez, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you can find it on YouTube, great fight. Comes back, fights Olivares again, fights a great 10-rounder with Bazooka Limon, who, has, I think, a pretty good argument to be on this list also. Fights Olivares again, finally beats him the third try. Had a few fights with Arturo Leon, who was a really good fighter. He fought these guys all multiple times. He fought a great fight with Alexis Arguello. Arguello was just slightly better than him. The 2 fights with Cornelius Boza Edwards, both great fights. The second fight in 82 was the fight of the year. Ray Mancini, absolute war, 3 rounds there. Mancini was a lot bigger fighter. He comes in as a give-and-take battle, a lot like Hagler Hearns, until Mancini's just general size takes him down. Fights a 7-round war with Arturo Frias, who's another guy that could be on this list. So my number 4 is Bobby Chacon.
Bobby Chacon was originally on my list. Then in the process of adding guys, looking at guys, somehow he fell off. But he would definitely, if I had a number 11, he'd probably be it. Tremendous fighter and a guy who reinvented himself late in his career. If you remember, he was around the time that he fought Boza Edwards the first time. He was done. He was shot. And then the next year he comes back and, he beats Bazooka Limon for the title, has, an exciting fight with Boza Edwards and completely reinvents himself, and then qualifies for that matchup with Mancini. And yeah, definitely a compelling character to watch and follow in the 70s and early 80s.
All right, my number 3 will be Thomas the Hitman Hearns. His first 15 or 16 fights, it was kind of like watching the Mike Tyson reel of his first 15 or 16 fights. The only difference is this. Tommy Hearns knocked out some guys his first 15, 16 fights that were pretty good. Guys like Clyde Gray. Bruce Finch was solid, ended up challenging for the title, I think 5 years later against Sugar Ray Leonard. Harold Weston, who was a really good fighter. Bruce Curry, really good fighter, just destroyed them all. Mike Colbert was a solid fighter who actually took him to the distance, one of the first guys to do that. Then, of course, you have the legendary knockout of Pepino Cuevas, who was a big banger. He takes out in 2 rounds. He fights a tough Randy Shields, beats him, loses the war to Sugar Ray Leonard, comes back, and he fought, I don't know if you remember, but he fought Ernie Singletary. I think it was his first middleweight fight on the undercard of Ali and Berbick, which actually was a very entertaining fight. He ended up winning. Then he comes back and knocks out Marcus Geraldo in 1 round. Marcus Geraldo was a solid middleweight. Beats Wilfred Benitez on a unanimous decision at the Superdome in New Orleans. I think that was the co-main event with Lupe Pintor and Wilfredo Gomez, I think.
Yeah.
Benitez actually stood and fought a little bit. It was actually an entertaining fight for Benitez fight. And then he goes through a little bit of a lull. Murray Southern, Luigi Mancillo, all go to distance with him. People are starting to think maybe he doesn't have the power at the higher weight class. And then Roberto Duran runs into his right hand, and everybody realizes he still does. Destroyed Fred Hutchings. Gets his shot against Marvelous Marvin Hagler. Loses a 3-round war. It's a fight that, much like Leonard's first fight against Duran, even in defeat, they showed how great they were. And then he comes back, he fights James Black Gold Schuler, who was a great amateur. A lot of people thought Schuler had a chance. He destroys Schuler. He goes all the way up to, I believe, light heavyweight to beat Dennis Andres, who was a solid fighter. Beat Juan Roldan, knocked him out in 4 rounds. Hagler had some problems with him. But the thing that made him exciting was this. You never knew when somebody was going to tap him on the chin and, turn the fight around real quick. He had the fight with Iran Barkley, which nobody knew who the hell Iran Barkley was. The next thing you know, Barkley's knocked him out in 3 rounds. He gets the draw with Leonard, which a lot of that's got to do with his not taking the punch. He even went life and death with Michael Elijah, who hurt him a couple times early in the fight. And then when everybody thinks he's done, he steps up, fights in his prime Virgil Hill, who was a great fighter, beats him, and then, of course, he comes back and he loses a split decision to Iran Barkley. So my number 3 is Tommy the Hitman Hearns. I just think you look at his career, there's a ton of exciting knockouts, and there's a ton of exciting fights just because he didn't take the greatest punch in the world.
It's funny, I just wrote an article about Tommy Hearns, but I left him off this list. A lot of, I think Tommy Hearns is historically underrated, and I think he was a tremendous fighter. I guess, my logic for leaving him off, he was a spectacular knockout puncher, one of the great punchers in history, a lot of one-sided fights. You have, the dynamic of his chin. You never quite know, who's going to catch him and when. But, in the end, again, if there's such a thing as a guy being too good to be exciting, I think he may fall into that category.
Well, I thought it was exciting, but all right, good. Rip me apart. What's your number 3?
No, I didn't rip you apart. This is my first of 2 exceptions to the modern rule. My number 3 is Rocky Marciano. Again, this guy had few, if any, dull fights, tremendous punching power, one-punch knockout capability, a great ability to absorb punishment and rally in the face of adversity. He had the fight against an aging Joe Louis that was pretty good. You had him rallying from behind to knock out Jersey Joe Walcott with that vicious right hand in the 13th round in 1952. You have two tough fights with Ezra Charles, the second of which he rallies from nearly being stopped on cuts to start him in the 8th. Even in his last fight against Archie Moore, he has to get off the deck to knock him out in the 9th. He's an all-time great at heavyweight, but at the same time, he's just vulnerable enough to make every fight interesting. Not great defensively, tendency to cut. So often he takes a lot of punishment, but, at least, in every instance where he was given the opportunity, he always rallied behind and from behind to carry it, to win the fight.
All right. I don't have him there. I don't think it was that many exciting fights, but I do see where he was exciting. And you know what? Like they always say, anytime you talk about boxing and heavyweights, there's always got to be a white guy to say Rocky Marciano. Was it Coming to America? You ever see that?
I think it was.
Yeah. Every time you start talking about boxing, some white guy's got to bring up Rocky Marciano.
Joe Louis was 72 years old when he fought him.
172. We're at your number 2 now.
All right, my number 2 is on your list. Aaron the Hawk Pryor.
Okay.
Another all-time great, a guy who was a whirlwind of perpetual motion, threw over 100 punches, per round. But again, a guy who was vulnerable enough to make every fight interesting and entertaining to watch. I think the first time I saw him was when he decimated Lennox Blackmore in the 2nd round in, I think, June of 1981, and had no idea who he was, and I'm like, wow, who was that guy? Then he had the great fight with, which I think he talked about, with DeJuan Johnson later that year, where he gets knocked down early, but gets off the deck, absorbs the punishment, and stops him in 7. As you said, he gets dropped by the nondescript Akio Kameda, coming back to stop him in 6. And, the classic first fight with Arguello in November of 1982. I think, we've said enough on that one. And, the second Arguello fight was also pretty good, too. Not quite as dramatic, but still an excellent fight. Unfortunately, his career goes off the rails from there, but you have a guy who scored 35 stoppages and 39 wins, including 32 of his first 34. And, never a dull moment with Aaron Pryor.
All right. Well, I'll have to agree with you since I got him on my list, so we'll just let that one go. My number 2 was my favorite fighter growing up, outside of, Scott Ledoux, and that would be Matthew Saad Muhammad. I wrote an article about Muhammad for Sports Rants a while back. I think the thing people don't realize about him is this. His 14th fight, or his 12th fight, he fought Matt Parlov, who ended up winning a light heavyweight title. He actually went to Italy in his 12th fight and beat Parlov in his home country. He comes back and fights Marvin Camel, who ended up being, I believe, wasn't he the first cruiserweight champion of the world?
Yes, he was.
Yeah, and he beats him on a split decision. Then he comes back and he fights Camel again and loses a majority decision. Then he goes back to Italy to fight Parlov again and gets a draw. Then he fights Eddie Mustafa Muhammad in a great fight in Philadelphia. We had Eddie on about 6 to 8 weeks ago. He talked about Matthew Saad Muhammad, how it was one of the toughest fights, one of the toughest fighters he'd ever fought. Muhammad beat him by a split decision in Philadelphia. Then he fights Marvin Johnson the first time in Philadelphia. Great fight. He actually knocked out Bill Dynamite Douglas, Buster Douglas' dad, in the 6th round in Philly. And then he gets on a run where he knocks out David Lee Royster, Richie Cates, Dale Grant, leads him up to his first fight with Yaki Lopez, which he won by a TKO in 11, comes back and fights Marvin Johnson, knocks him out in 8, comes back and fights John Conte, and beats him. It ended up being scored a draw or something, so they had a rematch because of something. He did something wrong. I don't even remember what it was now. But he comes back and knocks Conte out in 4. Comes back and fights the rematch with Yaki Lopez. One of the great fights you'll ever see. I think it was at like the 8th or 9th round where he absorbed like 20 or 30 unanswered punches. They didn't stop the fight. He comes back and wins. Beats solid contenders, Von Zell Johnson, Murray Sutherland, Jerry DeBull Martin. Finally loses his title to Dwight Muhammad Kwawi, loses to Kwawi again. And the thing is this, with him, not necessarily even face first puncher or face first fighters ways, in 6 years, he fought like 25 fights, and probably 20 to 25 guys were top 10 contenders or champions. So I definitely believe he belongs in the top 2.
Okay. No, I had him at number 4, so certainly can't argue with it.
Well, you're just way the hell off, but that's all right.
Only 2 spots.
You were way off. But, all right, so we haven't done your number 2 yet, have we?
No, my number 2 is Pryor.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So I guess we did do it. So when you said no, you lied. All right, so we are to our number 1 fighter, but first we're going to have to take a message from Gridiron Mo.
This is former All-Pro Leon Searcy. I've got a new interactive app called Gridiron Mo, where you get to call the plays, offense or defense, and a live NFL game. You get to interact with other fans, pick the play, pick the call. That's Gridiron Mo.
All right, we're back to count down myself, Mike Goodpaster, and my co-host Dave Siderski's top 10 most exciting boxers of all time. We are at number 1, so Dave, I will let you go first. Who's your number 1 most exciting fighter of all time?
Okay, my number 1 is the second retro guy on this list, Homicide Hank, Henry Armstrong. It was a toss-up for me between him and Pryor, literally. But Armstrong, another guy who was just perpetual motion, threw nonstop punches the entire fight from the first round to the final bell. A 3-division world champion when that actually meant something. 3 legit divisions of the original 8. 101 knockouts and 151 wins. 27 straight over a 14-month period between January of 1937 and March of 1938. Between 1937 and 1939, he was an amazing 51-2 with 44 knockouts. You have classics with guys like, legendary guys like Barney Ross, Fritzy Zivic, Lou Ambers, against whom he got jobbed in a rematch because he lost 5 rounds due to low ball calls. Lou Jenkins, Sammy Angott, Hippie Larkin, then the list goes on and on. Boundless stamina, a vicious body puncher, excellent power. Again, the choice between him and Aaron Pryor was a toss-up for me, but I ended up going with Homicide Hank and, 2 guys of very similar style because Armstrong, he did it for longer and he did it against better opposition. So,
all right, here's my problem. Okay, what's the best fight you saw him fight?
The best, the video of him against Barney Ross probably. And I know it's not the same as seeing it live, but I think he's, again, I went.
It's a lot better if you see it complete, which it probably wasn't complete either, was it?
No, I would agree with you there. I think he was so unique that he had to be, an exception to the rule in this case for me.
No exceptions to my rule. My number 1's Jack Dempsey. No, I'm kidding. My number 1 is Evander Holyfield, which may sound crazy since you only had him at 9, but hear me out. 12th fight of his career, he fought Dwight Muhammad Kwawi, who was a great fighter. I don't care what anybody says. And he fought an absolute war over 15 rounds, wins a split decision against the experienced Kwawi in his 12th fight. Comes out, knocks out Henry Tillman, Ricky Parkey, Ozzy Ocasio, who, he fought Larry, he fought everybody. Didn't beat too many. I remember he beat Jimmy Young once, but he didn't have too many great wins, but still a solid fighter. Knocks out Kwawi 4 rounds in a rematch, which was, I think, a year and a half after the first fight. Beat Carlos De Leon, who was a very good fighter. Then he moves up to heavyweight. Beats James Quick Tillis, Pinklin Thomas, Michael Dokes in an absolute war. Destroys Adelson Rodriguez. First fight with Alex Stewart, absolute war. And if you remember the time, I think Stewart was like 24-0 with 24 knockouts. Then he fights Buster Douglas, destroys Douglas, fights a really, really good fight against George Foreman, exciting fight. Then you get the fight against Burt Cooper. Heck, he's down and looks like he's done. Gets up, knocks out Cooper a round or two later. The fight against Larry, put it like it, almost every fight he ever made turned out to be competitive no matter who he fought. And then you get the trilogy with Riddick Bowe. First fight, absolute, I think it was the 9th or 10th round? One of the greatest rounds in boxing history, especially for heavyweights, up there with the Holmes-Norton rounds, Ali Frazier. Comes back after that and wins a unanimous decision against Stewart. Not a great fight the second time around. But then he comes back, wins a majority decision, the Fan Man fight against Bowe. Absolute great fight. Comes back, fights Michael Moorer, and they say there's something wrong with his heart. He loses a lackluster decision, which one of the few times I bought a pay-per-view with Evander Holyfield, and I felt like I didn't get my money's worth. Takes a year off. You know, doctor says trouble with his heart, might have to retire. Comes back, fights Merciless Ray Mercer, 10-round war again. Comes back, fights Riddick Bowe for the third time, 8-round war, ends up getting knocked out. But still, the heart problem's there. He tired quickly at the end of in the middle rounds, ends up getting knocked out. He comes back, fights Bobby Chez. He beats Bobby Chez in 5, did not look great. So, of course, Mike Tyson now will fight him, since it looks like that, you know, it's going to be an easy win. And he comes out and just batters Mike Tyson. And, I mean, it was a great one-sided fight because I like to watch Mike Tyson get his ass whooped. I'm sorry, I said it. There it is. Everybody under 35, I don't care what the hell you say. He was overrated. He comes back, fights Tyson a second time, beat him so bad the first time Tyson would do anything not to take an ass whooping in front of the world again. So he bites a hunk of his ear off. He gets the rematch. Gets the rematch with Moore. Absolutely great fight again. Knocks him out. Fights Von Bean. That's what your career has gone to shit when you're defending your heavyweight title at home against Von Bean. He wore a little beanie thing, too. I think Butch was. I don't know. He also got a title shot against Michael Moore, too, and got his ass whipped. Boring fighter. If we had a list of 10 most boring fighters, Von Bean would probably be on it. He fought John Ruiz 3 times. John Ruiz was an absolute disgrace as a boxer. I'm sorry. I'll never call a boxer bum. It takes a lot of balls to get in there. But John Ruiz would once again be on the top 10 most boring fighters list of all time. He liked to grab and hug. He had a little bit of a resurgence where he put the hematoma on Hasim Rockman in 8 rounds. And then he loses to Bird, gets knocked out by Tony, loses to Donald. He did beat Jeremy Bates. The funny thing about Jeremy is his nickname was Master. Get that, Dave. And then he beats Freza Kendo, Vinny Mataloni. Yeah, Vinny Mataloni. He beats Lou Savarese. The Lou Savarese fight I actually paid for on pay-per-view because I was made up with dumbass sometimes. And the Lou Savarese Evander Holyfield fight was actually a really good fight. And then he goes to Moscow to fight Sultan Ibragimov. Boring fight. Then he fights Nikolai Volyev, which, once again, my dumbass was happier than hell to pay to see. And actually, I thought he won because he landed the only punch that was landed during the fight, but they gave it to Volyev because they were fighting in Switzerland. You know how them Swiss people are. Then he fight Francois Botha, which I am proud to say that I was smart enough not to buy that. Ended his career with a 10th round TKO over Brian Nielsen, who was a bum. I'm sorry. But I mean, the thing was this. He stopped him in 10 rounds in Denmark. But the reason I say he's a bum is this. I always respect any boxer who goes in the ring. But Brian Nielsen was basically just a fat tub of goo. And you know, they gave him decisions against Larry Holmes, guys like that. He stopped Mike Tyson in 6 rounds, which, once again, you Mike Tyson fans, overrated. Can you say overrated? Because Muhammad Ali today could probably whip Brian Nielsen's ass back then. So my number 1 is Evander Holyfield.
Okay, all right. So I got to stop laughing here.
And I'm hoping that we get Jeremy Masturbates on the fucking show here pretty soon.
Sounds like he has a personal problem to me, but yeah, obviously.
That's the nickname. He's just Master.
But well. All right, I'm gonna keep myself out of trouble here. Yeah, Holyfield.
Yeah, I said the F word too, so now it's me and Peter McNeely have done it. And also, Peter McNeely is going to be on the show. We're going to have him on in the middle of October to preview the Tyson Fury Vladimir Klitschko heavyweight title fight.
Oh, yeah, you were mentioning that last week. Great.
Yeah, he sent me
Great.
a message that he'd love to do it.
Awesome.
We'll do it. But any final words?
Great show as always.
Why are you laughing?
You just
bring up a guy's
because
nickname and all of a sudden you're all giddy and giggly.
Your last diatribe was funny. Great show as always. Enjoyed it. Look forward to doing more, and follow me on Ringside Reports and Mythical Boxing, and Dave at DCS5099 on Twitter.
All right, you can follow me at RiverMonster11. Make sure to go on Facebook, find the Grueling Truth Facebook page, follow us there. We will have a boxing show next Tuesday night also. May have a guest next Tuesday night. Haven't made up our mind yet. Over the week, well, you can actually go back also on there and catch our interviews with guys like former champions Winky Wright, Carlos Palomino, Tim Witherspoon. Done a little bit of all of them. We'll have more in the future. Also, don't forget to check out the football side of it. We'll have the Cincinnati Bengals show with me and Joe Kelly. San Francisco 49ers show with Matt Andrews-Cabbage and Dexter Carter. Those should both be released Thursday morning. Tomorrow, let's see, every Wednesday morning, look out for the NFL Pick'em show with myself, Matt Andrews-Cabbage, and former All-Pro offensive lineman Leon Searcy. So I think that's about all we got for tonight. Dave?
I think that's all I got. Great show.
But I'm going to look for Jeremy Bates. We're going to get him on the show. So if anybody out there knows Jeremy Bates, have him give us a call. But for Dave Siderski, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.